creation of Renaissance history by humanists. The posthumously ascribed epithet Renaissance pointed to a rebirth of Rome's universal superiority, implying the inferiority of the intervening period. This apparently embarrassing interval included the collapse of the Roman Empire and the ongoing threats to church supremacy. The concurrent boom in Italian wealth, through urbanization, trade and banking, the growth of patronage and influence exercised by the wealthy, and the cynical enterprise and agency employed by talented artisans and scholars, ultimately provided the finance and skills to combat these challenges. In Italy, and subsequently throughout the courts of Europe, Renaissance humanism resembled a medieval case of keeping up with the Joneses. Beneath the facade of magnificent monuments and mesmerizing manuscripts incredibly unearthed, the Renaissance was a perverse propaganda program designed to drown out calls for church reform. It was both a desperate and a conceited attempt to preserve its power, authority, and legitimacy through fanciful reimagining of a largely unrecorded and unverifiable past. The humanists sought to identify Rome's golden age, which preceded its ruinous fall, and replicate aspects conducive to a revival of its power, albeit under the auspices of the only surviving Roman institution, the Church. The inevitable conundrum being that classical texts were inherently pagan, and therefore would have undoubtedly perished in the intervening period since Christ, whether they fell victim to Father Time or Christian zealotry, or simply because the various monasteries and scriptoriums were not founded until several hundred years after the respective documents were allegedly penned. These inescapable realities have been consistently ignored. Nevertheless, in the flourishing fake market of the Renaissance, perceived authenticity was paramount. Unfortunately, this model has persisted amongst classicists and traditionalists ever since. Historically, England and Germany had persistently challenged and undermined Rome and its church. Pelagius, less than a century before Rome's collapse, had suffered for resisting Augustine of Hippo's theory on original sin. This heretical type continued through Occam and Wycliffe, and was mirrored and supported in Germany up to, during and after the Hussite Wars, and throughout the Reformation. This former province in particular, which had been conquered by Rome so long ago, had subsequently sacked Rome and brought it low. It now appeared determined to inadvertently undermine the last remaining vestige of the empire, the Church. The Council of Constance's condemnation of Wycliffe and Huss's heretics, and the ensuing Hussite Wars, initiated the humanists' imaginative reconstruction of Britain and Germany's pre-Roman histories. The objective was to present an image of coarse pagan provinces, which had been subsequently enlightened and advanced through subservience to Rome. The humanist method has been characterized more recently by George Orwell in 1984. Who controls the past, controls the future. Who controls the present, controls the past. The expedient discovery of spurious ancient manuscripts sought to elevate Rome and demote dissenters. What is notable and telling is that the earliest Tacitian evidence fingered England and Germany specifically, and materialized in unison. It introduced derogatory narratives of pre-Roman backwardness in Britain and Germany, the respective homelands of the influential contemporary heretics Wycliffe and Huss. Moreover, the discoveries represent the typical argument of Renaissance humanism, namely, an inferred solution to a contemporary problem from an ancient example. In this particular case, the Roman Church was essentially asserting that if Britain and Germany fostered dissenters, it would cause their respective countries to regress and degenerate. In typical humanist fashion, their new historical evidence also implied that Rome had benevolently raised these countries from their backward pagan past. However, the message was pitched and received very differently by each country. Germania was largely complimentary about the German people, which it claimed to report on. Agricola and the Annales were largely negative about the British, and presented them as fickle, deceitful, divided, and easily defeated. In Germany, the narrative of an indigenous people who were strong, warlike, competent, democratic, moralistic, independent, and resourceful was readily accepted and embraced by its people. Similarly, their professed simplicity and highlighted pagan past was evidently not a source of embarrassment, as it was intended, but was instead interpreted as confirmation of their inherent Volkish wholesomeness and their diametric opposition to the crookedness of the Roman Church. The intended insinuation was that Germany owed its significant advancement from pagan poverty to Rome's historic instruction in Christianity. However, many Germans believed that Wycliffe and Hus had successfully argued and demonstrated that the contemporary church bore no resemblance to its ancient relative, which only invigorated calls for church reform. In England, the condition of the country was markedly different to that of Germany. In his History of England, Keith Feeling describes the period in which the Tacitean works were imagined as the national collapse. Henry V had died, and his successes in France had all been reversed and more lost. The infant Henry VI was essentially entrusted to Cardinal Beaufort, who placed the Roman Church foremost in the young king's mind. However, such religious single-mindedness came at an extraordinary financial cost to the country, and saw the king's debts to Italian lenders double in a decade. Concurrently, and amongst the many claimants who battled for the English crown, an obscure relative of the legitimised Beaufort line won through, and in 1506, the beholden king invited the humanist papal collector, Polydore Virgil, to compose a new history of England, the first to include the imaginings of Tacitus, but still too early for those of Dio. The English Reformation was somewhat delayed by the accession of the loyal and legitimised Beaufort bloodline. However, Henry VIII's subsequent excommunication, the Pope's denial of his dominions, and the accession of his Protestant son, Edward VI, reinvigorated the humanist allegories of an imagined British history. Cassius Dio's rehashed commentaries of Caesar, misrepresentations of Suetonius, and insertion of characters from Tacitean fables were published in 1548, the year after England crowned its first Protestant king. The designer of Dio's work pretentiously elaborated the fictions of Tacitus and cynically intertwined falsehoods and fallacious facts. Dio alone is responsible for the fantastical notion of Claudius's victory arch, which has persisted through the cynical appropriation of unrelated archaeological finds, hypothetical discoveries, and outright forgeries since the 16th century. Dio